In this video, we're going to do a walkthrough of a create DB workflow that will allow you to create a DB instance within RDS and also allow you to create the DB. Now, this is part 1 of 2 of working with databases within the Orchestrator. So this one, what we're going to do is we're going to show you how you can actually set this up so that it will actually create the DB instance. In this case, we're using RDS and AWS. And then create the database. So let's get started. So first thing we're going to do is kind of walk through this workflow over here. And you could see that on the left-hand side, I'm just going to view the run. And what we'll do is we'll see all the I/O, the input and output that this went through and all the logic in order to do the things that we want to do. So the first thing we did is we created a DB instance. And what we did is I actually used a atomic action to do that. And let's edit this so we can take a look at it. So I created a DB instance, and this atomic action, all it does is, if I open it up, is it will call the actual function or API call that is from AWS and RDS. So we created this previously. I even showed it in a previous tutorial. And all we do is ask for the inputs that we need. So we ask for the DB name, the master username, and the master password. And you can see that what I did is I filled these in with input variables. So when I actually run this script, it will actually prompt for these 3 things that I have here. And the nice part about that is I've actually used this in other parts of the script. So we only have to enter these things once, and then we can use them in multiple parts. Now, once we call that function to create a DB instance, we have to actually loop until it gets to a state where it says it's actually created. I called that provisioned, and I'm calling it provisioned equals true. So this first function right here, or this first action, is a loop until provisioned equals true. So basically, it'll continue to loop, and then it'll check if the variable that I set up, which is called provisioned, is set to true. If not, it keeps looping until that's set. So we actually have to set that at some point, and we do that a little further down. Then the next part of the loop is another atomic action that I created the same way as the create above. And what it does is it just describes the RDS instances. And we'll see what that looks like when I actually go through the run again. But what it does is return a bunch of JSON, and then we have to parse out some of that JSON. So we only want certain variables. And I use this action called, and it's over on the left-hand side over here under table. If you go down to table, there's something that says read table from JSON. And what's nice about that is it asks you for like a root path, a JSON path here, and this will be where it starts. So it returns a bunch of stuff within JSON, but on that path, I start from the root. I go to describe DB instances response, describe DB instances result, DB instances, and then DB instance. And I tell it to return everything below that path. And then I'm only looking for 3 different variables that I'm setting there. And I'm setting DB instance identifier, the endpoint, and the DB instance status. Those are the only 3 things I care about out of all that JSON that it sends through there. Now, when you think about this, I actually have a few different instances here. So I actually have 2. I have AODB, which I just created, and that's what we're going to look at to see what the run through was. And I have another one that's a WordPress. So I know that there's 2 things that are going to pop up there. There could potentially be an unlimited amount. So I actually have to loop through there. Once I get that information, I have to loop through and see if I can find a certain instance that we've identified. So when I actually created this, we created a DB instance name, and that's one of the 3 parameters that this prompts for when you run it. So what I do is I loop through the DB instances. So I just tell it to loop through the source array of this previous step here of this table, and then I check for the correct instance identifier. So I go down, and this is just a conditional block, and I say if the DB instance identifier in this loop that it goes through equals the DB instance name that I set when this actually ran, then run what's under that. Then the next thing I check to do to see if it's in a provisioned state. So I actually go through here, and it says it checks the actual state here. So it checks to see whether the DB instance status equals available. If it does, it runs through whatever's in this box. If it doesn't, then it just continues. And it continues along, it'll go through, it'll loop again, and it will actually do this all over again and do all those things I just mentioned. Once that's done, that will actually, once it actually hits this, it will actually set the endpoint variable. So it looks through, it gets the endpoint, and it sets the variable endpoint to the looped JSON that it found to that endpoint. And then it parses the address from that endpoint. So actually, I got to do two things. One thing is that in the endpoint, it actually gives me a bunch of JSON under that. So I actually have to parse that JSON to get just the address piece of that. So in this, you'll see that I'm looking for the $, which means root.address, and just return the address piece of that endpoint function. So this is something interesting that I should mention. So originally I got all that information from the table, which gave me a root path, and we'll click on this one more time, and returned a table of 3 different values here. And I'm going to show this when I do the run. But in one of those pieces, I just asked for endpoint, but endpoint actually contained a string that included more JSON. So I had to do further processing on that. And the way I did that is I used a core function that it's up here that is called, and let me just get up to it, go to core. It's called JSON path query. And you could see this is a JSON path query, which asks me for what the path is that I'm looking for, and then what I want to set the string as. So once I did that, I set all that. And then the next function is just to set the address there. So that got the input of all this stuff. Basically, these 3 are all kind of grouped together to create this, just to get the address that I'm going to need for create DB. And then the last thing I do is set provision state true, which will end the loop the next time around. So we want to make sure to do that, or we'd have an infinite loop. Now, when we come down to the MySQL to create the MySQL instance, you'll see that this is where I needed that address right here. So this workflow address, this is the address that the Amazon RDS created when it created that instance of MySQL. So I needed that, and that's what these 3 things did right there. So let's go through the run and see what actually happened. So this last run, you could see here, there was a create DB, and this is the one that worked. And you can see when you actually do these, there's a lot of things that you're troubleshooting. So you can see that there were some good runs, there were some bad runs. Red always means bad. But the nice part about this, if we just click on this once again, you'll see exactly what was wrong at the bottom. So anything red is bad, and you could see exactly what was bad. And if I click on that, I could actually see why it was bad. This one, it can't create it because it already existed. So I was running through this stuff a few times. I had already created databases, and I forgot to delete one. So that was pretty self-explanatory. But let's go back to the one that actually worked. And you'll see that this is multiple parts. So the first thing I did is I created that DB instance. I put in AODB, I put in my username, and I put in a password. Not very secure. This stuff isn't really going to exist in real life anyway after we're done with this. So I'm not really concerned about security right now. But then we went through the loop, right? So we said, okay, let's start this loop. Let's check if provision state equals true. And right now it doesn't. But you can see that this is one of 19. So this looped 19 times before Amazon came back and said that the provision state equaled available, and which I said then the provision state equaled true. So one of the things we did is we described the RDS instance. So this, all it does is after it creates it, it loops a bunch of times, and each time it describes the RDS instance so we can get a bunch of data. You can see all that data is a bunch of JSON in here, but really all I care about is 3 pieces. So we talked about this. This returns a table. And you can see the 3 things that I want to get are DB instance identifier, endpoint, and DB instance status. So it gives you the JSON here. Here's all the JSON it returned. But down here is really all the pieces that I needed. It gives me the DB instance identifier, the endpoint, and the status. So right now we're looking at the status. You can see that in 1, it equaled creating. Now, when we get to like 19 or 18 of this iteration, it probably says backing up, which is, so now I'm on 18 of 19, and I'm describing that. And let's go a little bit further down. And we'll see that I went too far here. Let's see. Oh, whoops, let me go to the table here. That Here we go. The AODB here, backing up. So the last step before it's available is backing up. So once it's not quite available yet, but let's go to 19 now. So if I go all the way down to iteration 19, you'll see that 19 of 19, it's now there. And if I click over here to those 3 parameters of the table, you'll see that now it says available. So once it says available, this loop is still going through 1 and 2 to see which instance it is. You can see that 1 is going to be AODB and 2 is going to be WPDB. So really, we only care about 1, 2 is something else. So once 1 is there, we check the instance identifier, and obviously that matched. And then we check to see whether the provision state was true. And once that was done, we could see that this whole area ran. So we can see that we set the endpoint address variable over here. Let me just click out of that for a second here. And then we parse that address from the endpoint, and then we set that address variable. So we did a bunch of things here. And then finally what we did is we created that DB. And let me just refresh the screen real quick, because for some reason it's giving me a little bit of a headache here. So, okay, so let's go back to 19. That seemed like a little browser issue at that point. And you can see we set the endpoint variable. So let's just go over this again. And so the endpoint variable, you can see contained address, but that address also contains some JSON. We just want this one little piece that comes from here to here. That's all we want, because we want to use that in the MySQL call. So then we have parsed the address from the endpoint. And as you can see, each one of these steps you're actually walking through, and you could see the input and output of each one of these steps as you walk through it. So it makes it very easy. So now we just have the address piece that we need. Then all we're doing is setting the variable to that address piece. And then we set that provision state to true. So we set that to true. And then the last piece that we did here is we created a database with the same name as the instance. So we used all of that, it created that, and we could see down here that using a password and the interface is insecure. There's obviously other ways to do that that we know about, but we just didn't do it for the sake of this demo. But it was successful. So it created all that. And at the end of the day, what we have here is a database instance that was created in RDS, and it also created the database inside. And you can see that here. If I click on AODB, you'll see that I have that database here, and everything was created. So in the next demo, or the next walkthrough, what we're going to do is talk about how to use databases inside of the workflow engine. So stay tuned for that next episode.